Hey, what's up everyone? Carl here from TechTubeMedia, and with me I've got the OnePlus One. Now, if you haven't heard of the phone or the company itself, it's okay. They're actually a new startup, a Chinese startup that pretty much came out of nowhere and blindsided both the low-cost and the high-spec smartphone industries with what they call a flagship killer. Really, it is what they planned for it to be, and if you take a look at the specs of this phone and compare it with some of the other high-end flagships of 2014, you can definitely see that. Here, the OnePlus One is powered with a 2.5 GHz Snapdragon 801 processor with the Adreno 330 graphics chip. It comes with 3 gigs of RAM, has a 16 or 64 gigabyte built-in storage capacity that's non-expandable, by the way, a 13 megapixel camera, and a 5.5-inch 1920 by 1080p display with a 3100 milliamp hour battery. Now, that sounds pretty familiar, and once you compare it with some of the flagships from 2014, you could definitely see the edge that this has on them. So I'm going to take the HTC One M8, for example. You could use any flagship from 2014 that's been released to date so far, but I personally think the M8 is probably the best phone that came out this year. It's got the same Snapdragon 801 chip that's actually clocked slightly slower. It's got the same Adreno 330 graphics. It comes with 2 gigs of RAM, 16 or 32 gigabytes of onboard storage with a 4 megapixel ultra pixel camera on the back, a 5-inch 1920 by 1080p display, and a smaller 2600 milliamp hour battery. Alright, so spec-wise, it definitely hangs up there with some of this year's best flagships that are made by LG, HTC, Samsung, and Motorola, but what really makes this phone special is its price. So what OnePlus has pretty much done here is they've essentially gotten rid of the middleman. They're not dealing with any retailers, and they haven't partnered with any carriers to actually carry the OnePlus One. But they're also not spending absurd amount of dollars trying to market and advertise this phone, which is why you probably haven't heard of it. So if you look at price, the OnePlus One, the 16 gig model, sells for $300 US off contract, and the 64 gig version, which I have here, the Sandstone Black version, sells for $350 US, again, off contract. That means you're not dealing with any 2-year terms or any type of carrier lockdown. This is completely unlocked, and for $350, the 64 gigs, that's an insane deal. There is a catch though. Up until recently, the only way you can get your hand on this bad boy was through an invite. That's either you get it straight from OnePlus, or you get it from someone who's actually managed to order the phone and is able to give you an invite. But it's been 6 months so far, and the invite system's been pretty terrible. I mean, don't get me wrong, the phone is great, but since people can't get their hands on it, people are starting to lose interest quickly. The mobile industry didn't just wait for OnePlus to get their act together. Today you've got more powerful smartphones like the Sony Xperia Z3, the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, the Samsung Galaxy Note 4, and the all-new announced Nexus 6. Now granted, none of these phones, not even the Nexus 6, are priced anywhere close to the OnePlus One, but still, again, the appeal is fading away since you can't buy this. For the time being, I'd say if you're looking for a new phone, I'd still keep the OnePlus One on my shortlist, especially because the OnePlus One should be opening to the public soon. They've done a first round of pre-orders, and I believe they're doing a second round and maybe a third. I don't know if there's ever going to be a public release, but they're pretty much mass giving away invites now, and it should be easier to get your hands on it. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the review of the OnePlus One and see if it still impresses today. The actual phone is nice to hold. The 64 gigabyte Sandstone Black version has this very fabricy and grippy texture on the back. It doesn't have the same premium feel as the iPhone 6 or the HTC One, but it doesn't feel cheap either. It's very soft, and it definitely won't slip out of your hand. There is one thing though. Back when the phone was announced, OnePlus promised that you'd be able to swap out the back for what they called style swap covers. What those were is pretty much that you could replace the back with other materials like denim, Kevlar, bamboo. But they had to actually cancel the initiative because they couldn't get the implementation right. And it all stems from the fact that the back, it is removable, but it's extremely difficult to remove, and I haven't actually been able to do so. So I wouldn't recommend you, if you buy this phone, I wouldn't recommend you ever remove the back, ever, unless you really want to just, look at the battery. The OnePlus One has this metallic looking band that wraps around the frame of the phone, and I guess the idea was that it's supposed to make the phone look and feel more premium. But I don't understand why manufacturers think they can disguise cheap plastic with metallic look. The long-term quality of the phone would have been much better if OnePlus used actual metal. With that said, the OnePlus One fits in the hand very nicely. But another thing that I'm a little worried about is that the screen extrudes just a little bit from the rest of the body, and were it to fall, let's say for a drop test, or if it just fell out of your pocket, I'm sure the screen wouldn't fare too well. With a screen that measures 5.5 inches, you might think it's too big, and that's exactly what I thought at first, but trust me, it's surprisingly comfortable to hold, especially in one hand. The button placements are pretty much where you'd want them to be. They got that right on. So if you're holding the phone in your right hand, for example, you've got the power button right on your thumb, and you also have the volume rocker right accessible by your index and middle finger. On the back, you have a 13 megapixel shooter, and on the bottom, you've got dual mono speakers. Speaking of the camera, it's a 13 megapixel shooter with Sony lens. The software is nice. It's very straightforward. Swiping up or down cycles you through different camera modes. The shots that come out of it are just okay. Let's be real here. This isn't a $300 or $350 phone. It's not going to take iPhone 6 or Samsung Galaxy S5 shots. But I would say that it knocks out, when you compare this with other phones around the same price point, $350. Anything else, including the Nexus 5, it just knocks them right out of the water. But even with a 13 megapixel sensor, the photos don't seem to have that much detail. You'll definitely get better images with HDR enabled. From my tests though, the HDR photos tend to be a little oversaturated. That's a characteristic that I personally like. But the only downside is that HDR mode takes about 3 seconds to capture and process photos, which means that the subject has to be pretty still. On the front, there's also a 5 megapixel camera that takes pretty good selfie shots. Video quality is acceptable. The OnePlus One shoots 1080p video at 60 frames a second, which I think looks pretty good, but it also shoots at 4K Ultra HD at 30 frames per second for up to 5 minutes. And with enough natural sunlight, 4K recording actually looks really good. But as soon as you move inside to any type of artificially or dimly lit area, both 1080p and 4K recording get lots of noise and grain. Generally, I'm unimpressed with the camera when you compare it with something like the Samsung Galaxy S5 or the iPhone 6. But again, when you compare it to anything that's at the same price point, there's no matching this. When you're listening to music on the OnePlus One, the speakers are loud. You might think these are stereo speakers. You've got 2 speakers on the bottom, but technically they're still a mono. Unlike HTC's boom sound speakers, the OnePlus One speakers are being driven by only 1 amplifier. So, I mean, it's not a huge deal, but it would have been nice to have separate amps driving true stereo sound. The speakers aren't really bassy at all. It's a little tinny, but it's still quite acceptable. It's really nothing to be excited about. It's very similar to the speakers on the LG G3. This is probably the weakest component of the OnePlus One, but it could just be because I've been spoiled with the front-facing stereo boom sound speakers on the HTC One that I use. The battery life on this thing? I just can't talk about it. It's great. I consider myself a heavy user, and I was able to get through 12 hours with about 4 hours of screen on time with 1 charge. The standby battery life on the OnePlus One is a champ. So let's say you fall asleep at it at 100% and you wake up 8 hours later. You'll probably wake up to it at around 98 to 99%. With light use, you shouldn't have a problem lasting through a day and a half on this thing. The rest of the hardware is really good. Specs are starting to matter less and less now, especially since Android is becoming more optimized in general. But like you would expect with hardware like this, it flies through pretty much everything. I don't think I've seen a hiccup once. Websites load well in Chrome, games run extremely well, and the OnePlus One scores pretty good in synthetic benchmarks. Oh, and since in its most basic form, this is still just a phone that makes phone calls, it'd be pretty wrong if I don't touch on call quality for a minute. To date, I haven't had issues where the person on the other end couldn't hear me. Generally, I wish the volume was just a little louder through the earpiece, but overall the calling experience is pretty average. On the software side, the OnePlus One runs a stock custom ROM, if you could say that. It runs a modified version of CyanogenMod, and essentially it is a Cyanogen phone. The fact that it comes with CyanogenMod straight from the factory means that the OnePlus One is one of the more customizable phones on the market today. With CyanogenMod, you can change the icons, customize the status bar, and even change the boot animation without having to be rooted. By default, the OnePlus One has capacitive buttons enabled. You can actually turn those off and switch to on-screen buttons through the settings, which I find is a very neat feature that I wish more phones had. But I personally made the switch for one reason. I personally prefer having the off-screen buttons. I prefer having the capacitive buttons themselves because it frees up some screen real estate. The issue is that even though you have the option to go to capacitive buttons, and they are backlit, it's very dim. You pretty much can never tell what you're pressing unless you're in a very dark room, and me being used to the HTC One, which has the buttons in reverse order compared to the OnePlus One, I just couldn't get used to it, and I guess I'm just back to on-screen nav bars, which is fine. I guess it's doing just fine for the time being. I'm actually starting to feel that this specific version of CyanogenMod 11S that's made specifically for this phone is a little bit superior to vanilla Android, mainly because of the customization features that it offers straight out of the box. Like recent flagships, the OnePlus supports gestures, but it isn't perfect. I actually had to disable the flashlight music gestures because they were being activated by accident in my pocket. Now, with that being said, there is an option within CyanogenMod that allows you to disable gestures based on the proximity sensor. So if it notices the proximity sensor is in your pocket, it won't actually allow you to do any features. So if you just cover that up, it's right next to the camera. If you just cover up and you try to double tap the screen, it won't work, which I feel is a step in the right direction. It still happens sometimes, so it doesn't work 100%. With gestures, though, you can sleep and unsleep your phone with double taps. You can also launch the camera app by drawing a circle on the screen. You can shuffle through music and turn on the camera's flash. One thing that is missing that I would have loved to see baked into the OS is custom gestures. I feel like if you could record your own gestures that would open certain applications without having to go through the lock screen, that would have been great, personally. One other thing that I would have loved to see is the ability to control vibration intensity, and I'm not too sure whether this might be a hardware limitation or not, but I have definitely missed quite a few phone calls and a few texts just because the vibration on this thing when it's in your pocket, it isn't intense enough. When it's on a table, it's perfectly fine. You can hear it, it's very loud, but you just don't feel it in your pocket. And again, I would have loved for the metal band that wraps around the phone to be made out of actual metal instead of plastic. And I would also have preferred the chin to be just a little bit smaller, but other than that, this truly is a no-compromise phone. Hashtag never settle. And that pretty much wraps up my review of the OnePlus One. Do I recommend it? Definitely. Do I see it as a flagship killer? Yes, and kinda. You're getting a lot of phone for $350 here, but would I consider this the best phone on the market? Not necessarily. It all comes down to personal preference and what you personally look for in a phone. If you're looking for something that's a great value and something that costs less than $400, the OnePlus One is definitely your best bet. Thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know down in the comments below what you think of the OnePlus One. Do you have one? Are you still considering it? Leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you like this video and would like to see more content like this, but because I'm also trying to get my channel up and running again, if you've got any feedback on this video or would like me to cover anything else in the future, let me know down in the comments. Again, thanks for watching and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.